The autumn night wrapped around the quiet streets of suburban Virginia like a silk scarf, streetlights casting long shadows across the well-maintained lawns. It was just past 10 p.m. when a silver Honda Accord cruised down Cedar Lane, its driver lost in thought about the meeting he'd just attended. The man behind the wheel, Agent T, had spent 15 years building his cover identity in this community. To his neighbors, he was just another IT consultant, the kind of person who'd wave hello while collecting his morning paper, coach Little League on weekends, and show up at every community cleanup event. Tonight's meeting hadn't gone as planned. The intel suggested something big was brewing within the local police department, but he couldn't quite piece together all the elements yet. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he mentally reviewed the discussion with his handler. 3 years of deep cover work were starting to bear fruit, but timing would be everything. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror pulled him from his thoughts. Agent T checked his speed, 32 in a 35 zone. He eased the car toward the curb, muscle memory from years of training kicking in as he positioned the vehicle to give himself the best view of approaching officers in his mirrors. 2 police cruisers pulled up behind him, an unusual show of force for a routine traffic stop. Through his mirrors, he watched 4 officers emerge, their hands already resting on their weapons. Something wasn't right. His training screamed at him to react, but his mission parameters were clear: maintain cover at all costs. Keep calm, he whispered to himself, placing his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The dashboard clock blinked 10:17 p.m. In less than an hour, this quiet suburban street would become the epicenter of a story that would shake the foundations of local law enforcement and expose a conspiracy reaching far beyond Virginia's state lines. The first officer approached, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness with aggressive intensity. "License and registration," the officer demanded, skipping the customary greeting. His nameplate read Officer P, and his hand hadn't left his weapon. The second officer circled the car, flashlight beam dancing across the windows. Agent T noticed their body cameras were dark, no blinking red lights indicating recording. His mind cataloged every detail while maintaining the pleasant, slightly confused expression of an ordinary citizen. "Of course, officer," he replied, his voice carrying just the right mix of respect and mild concern. "May I ask why I was stopped?" "Suspicious behavior," Officer P replied curtly. "You were seen leaving a known drug trafficking area." Agent T's heart rate didn't even flutter at the obvious lie. The known drug trafficking area was actually a quiet coffee shop where he'd met his CIA handler, and he knew every security camera and surveillance point in a 5-block radius. What he didn't know, yet, was why these particular officers had chosen him as a target tonight. As he handed over his perfectly crafted fake license and registration, he caught a glimpse of the second officer speaking into his radio, voice too low to hear. In the distance, a third patrol car turned onto the street, lights off. The pieces started falling into place. This wasn't a random stop. They'd been waiting for him. Years of training had prepared him for moments like this, but something felt different. The officer's body language, their coordinated movements, the carefully staged approach. They weren't acting like cops making a routine stop. They were moving like men who thought they had just caught a big fish. Little did they know, they were about to become part of an operation much larger than they could imagine. As Officer P walked back to his cruiser with the documents, Agent T allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes, he reflected, the best way to catch a predator was to become the prey. The next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of corruption, shine a light on systemic racism within law enforcement, and ultimately lead to one of the most significant police reform movements in recent history. But for now, Agent T sat quietly, hands on the wheel, playing his role to perfection while the real drama was about to unfold. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." The command cut through the quiet night air. Agent T complied smoothly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists moments later, and Officer P guided him toward the patrol car with unnecessary force. From his new vantage point in the back of the police cruiser, Agent T watched the officer's coordinated movements through the window. They'd done this before, that much was clear. Officer P stood watch while his partner began what they called a routine search of the Honda. The third patrol car had parked behind the others now, its headlights off. A figure emerged, carrying what looked like a regular gym bag. Agent T's trained eye caught the subtle exchange, the bag passing from one officer to another like a baton in a relay race. His heart rate remained steady, even as he recognized the gravity of what was unfolding. "Look what we have here," one officer announced loudly, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. It was theatrical, staged for the benefit of any potential witnesses or later questioning. From the back seat, Agent T observed the carefully choreographed performance. They pulled out a package wrapped in layers of plastic, making a show of discovering it under the passenger seat. Next came documents, papers he'd never seen before, conveniently suggesting connections to international drug operations. The officers made sure to handle everything with gloves, maintaining a facade of professional procedure while planting the evidence that would justify their actions. "Looks like we've got ourselves a big one," Officer P called out, his voice dripping with false satisfaction. Multiple packages of suspected narcotics, documentation of international transfers. He listed off their findings like items on a shopping list. Agent T remained silent, watching the streetlights cast shadows across the officers' faces as they worked. His silence unnerved them. They were used to protests, to pleading, to anger. Instead, they got nothing but calm observation. Inside the patrol car, the night air grew thick with tension. Through the window, Agent T could see neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, their faces illuminated by the still flashing police lights. Some had their phones out, recording. Every witness, every video, every moment would become crucial pieces of evidence in what was to come. The officers' movements became more hurried now, less careful. They were rushing to finish their work, to get their suspect away from prying eyes and recording devices. Agent T noted how Officer P's partner kept glancing nervously at the growing number of onlookers. "We've got enough for trafficking charges," Officer P announced, closing the car's trunk with a heavy thud. "Multiple felonies, you're looking at serious time." He leaned into the patrol car window, expecting to see fear in his suspect's eyes. Instead, he found only steady, calculated observation. The drive to the station was filled with tense silence. The officers tried to provoke a response, dropping hints about the severity of the charges, making vague suggestions about dealing with reasonable people. But Agent T maintained his silence, mentally documenting every word, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. At the station, the booking process began. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork, all the standard procedures. The officers played their parts perfectly, acting out the role of dedicated law enforcement officers who'd just made a major bust. But beneath their professional demeanor, there was an undercurrent of satisfaction that went beyond normal police work. As they led him to a holding cell, Agent T caught fragments of their conversations, discussions about how this arrest would look good for their careers, jokes about another dealer off the streets. They had no idea they'd just stepped into a trap 3 years in the making. In his cell, Agent T sat on the hard bench and waited. He thought about the cameras in his car, the ones the officers hadn't found. He thought about the GPS trackers hidden in his shoes, still transmitting his location to his handlers. He thought about the dozens of federal agents who had been monitoring tonight's events, gathering evidence of their own. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. In a few hours, the morning shift would arrive, paperwork would be filed, and the wheels of justice would begin to turn. But not in the way these officers expected. Their attempt to frame an innocent man would instead expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. For now, though, Agent T closed his eyes and appeared to doze. Let them think they'd won. Let them believe their plan had worked perfectly. The real operation was just beginning, and these corrupt officers had unknowingly provided the key piece of evidence needed to bring down their entire network. Outside his cell, he could hear them laughing, celebrating their successful frame-up. Soon enough, those laughs would turn to something very different. But timing was everything, and for now, patience was his greatest weapon. The public defender's office was quiet except for the gentle hum of an ancient desk fan. Attorney R flipped through the case file for the 100th time, her forehead creased in concentration. Something about this case didn't add up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. Her new client, now known as Prisoner 247, had been in county jail for 2 weeks. Unlike most of her clients, he seemed oddly at peace with his situation. During their meetings, he spoke carefully, asking more questions about the officers involved in his arrest than about his own case. "Tell me again about the dashcam footage," she muttered to herself, pulling out the incident report. According to the paperwork, all cameras had malfunctioned during the traffic stop, both body cameras and the patrol car's dashboard camera. The statistical probability of all recording devices failing simultaneously was astronomically low. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. The night janitor handed her a plain brown envelope. "Found this while cleaning near your door," he said with a shrug. Inside the envelope, she found a USB drive and a handwritten note. "Watch the traffic cameras from Cedar Lane. Timestamp 10:15–10:45 p.m. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. Her computer whirred to life as she plugged in the drive. The video footage was grainy, but clear enough to show something the police report had conveniently omitted: a third patrol car arriving at the scene with its lights off. More importantly, it showed an officer carrying a bag to her client's car just before the discovery of drugs. Well, she whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "What do we have here?" Over the next few days, more evidence mysteriously appeared. Photographs of Officer P meeting with known drug dealers, bank statements showing unexplained deposits, internal affairs complaints that had been mysteriously dropped. Each piece was delivered anonymously, each one adding to a picture of widespread corruption. During her next jail visit, she studied her client more carefully. He sat with perfect posture, his eyes constantly scanning the room, noting every entrance and exit. His responses were measured, precise, not the behavior of a typical drug dealer. "The traffic camera footage is interesting," she mentioned casually, watching his reaction. A slight smile touched his lips. "Is it?" he replied, his tone giving away nothing. "You're not surprised by any of this evidence appearing, are you?" she asked. "Let's just say I have faith in the justice system," he responded. "Sometimes you have to let things play out naturally." Back in her office that evening, her phone rang, a blocked number. The voice on the other end was distorted. "Check the property records for Officer P's lake house," it said before hanging up. The next morning, she discovered the house had been purchased with cash through a shell company linked to a known drug cartel. Meanwhile, in his jail cell, Agent T maintained his cover perfectly. He spent his days reading borrowed legal books, occasionally making small talk with guards. But at night, when the cell block was quiet, he would lie awake, mentally reviewing the operation's progress. The anonymous tips arriving at his lawyer's office were right on schedule. His CIA handlers were executing the plan perfectly, feeding information at just the right pace to build an irrefutable case. Each piece of evidence was like a domino being carefully placed. When they finally fell, they would take down the entire corrupt network. Other inmates found him oddly calm for someone facing serious charges. He would sit in the common area, watching the news with mild interest as reports began to surface about internal investigations into the police department. Local reporters were starting to ask questions about Officer P's southern wealth. The web was beginning to unravel. Attorney R's reputation grew as she dug deeper into the case. Other lawyers started passing her information about similar cases, traffic stops gone wrong, evidence appearing out of nowhere, suspects who'd been pressured into pleading guilty. A pattern emerged, stretching back years. One evening, as she prepared for the preliminary hearing, another envelope appeared on her desk. This one contained a single photograph: Officer P shaking hands with one of the city's most notorious drug kingpins. On the back was written a simple message: "The truth comes out at the hearing." She stared at the photo, understanding dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel years of corruption. Her client wasn't just another victim of the system, he was something else entirely. As the hearing date approached, tension built in the police department. Officer P and his partners grew increasingly nervous, their confident swagger replaced by worried glances and hushed conversations. They knew something was coming, but they couldn't see the full picture yet. In his cell, Agent T smiled as he watched the evening news report about irregularities in recent drug arrests. Everything was falling into place. The preliminary hearing would be more than just a routine court appearance. It would be the moment when all the carefully laid pieces of the puzzle finally came together. Little did the corrupt officers know, but their attempt to frame an innocent man was about to expose a criminal enterprise that reached far beyond their small department. The dominoes were set. Now it was just a matter of time before they started to fall. 2 blocks from the police station, in what appeared to be an abandoned office building, a team of federal agents monitored a wall of screens. Each display showed different angles of the unfolding operation, surveillance footage, phone records, financial transactions, all painting a picture of corruption that had festered for years. "Play back the coffee shop meeting again," requested the lead agent, rubbing his tired eyes. The footage showed Agent T meeting his handler just hours before the arrest. They'd chosen the location carefully. A small cafe with plenty of exits and clear sightlines. The meeting had lasted exactly 7 minutes, just long enough to confirm that the corrupt officers had taken the bait. 3 years of work, the lead agent murmured, watching the scene unfold. 3 years of building this case, and they handed us exactly what we needed. The surveillance room hummed with activity as analysts tracked every movement of the corrupt officers. Officer P had made 3 calls since the arrest, all to burner phones linked to known drug traffickers. His partner had withdrawn large sums of cash from 4 different ATMs. They were nervous, making mistakes. One screen showed live footage from inside the jail. Agent T sat in his cell, reading a worn paperback book, the picture of calm in the midst of chaos. Few knew that his shoes contained state-of-the-art tracking devices, or that his seemingly routine medical checkup had allowed him to pass critical intelligence to his handlers. "Sir, you need to see this," called one of the analysts. She pulled up footage from a hidden camera near Officer P's lake house. The corrupt officer was burning documents in his backyard, unaware that every piece of paper had already been photographed by satellite surveillance. The operation had begun 3 years earlier, when patterns started emerging in drug trafficking cases. Too many coincidences, too many convenient arrests, too many cases thrown out on technicalities. Someone inside the police department was working with the cartels, but proving it required more than suspicion. That's when they'd brought in Agent T. His cover was perfect. A quiet professional who kept to himself, but remained friendly enough to avoid suspicion. He bought a house in the right neighborhood, joined the right gym, became part of the community. All while gathering intelligence on the corruption that was poisoning the city from within. "Check the bank records again," the lead agent instructed. "I want to know every penny that moved through their accounts." Financial analysts pored over spreadsheets, tracking money as it moved through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. On another screen, Attorney R worked late in her office, unaware that her anonymous tips came from the federal task force. They'd chosen her carefully too, a public defender known for her integrity and determination. She was building the case they needed, connecting dots they'd carefully laid out. The surveillance team watched Officer P's growing paranoia through cameras hidden in the police station. He snapped at colleagues, double-checked his locker for bugs, jumped at unexpected noises. His partner had started calling in sick, afraid to come to work. "Look at this pattern," observed one analyst, pointing to a timeline. Every major drug shipment coincided with specific officers being assigned to certain patrol routes. They've been providing security for the cartels for years. The evidence was overwhelming. GPS data showed police cruisers making regular stops at known drug houses. Phone records revealed a network of communication between officers and drug dealers. Bank statements told the story of bribes and payoffs disguised as legitimate transactions. In the jail, Agent T received his dinner tray, noting the small mark on the bottom that confirmed his messages were being received. 3 blinks of the overhead light told him the operation was proceeding as planned. He'd memorized every signal, every code, every contingency. The lead agent checked his watch. Preliminary hearing is in 12 hours. Everything needs to be perfect. The team had rehearsed their roles repeatedly. Federal marshals were already in position, disguised as courthouse maintenance workers. Every exit was covered, every scenario planned for. Through their surveillance, they watched Officer P make one last desperate move, trying to contact Agent T in his cell, hoping to strike a deal. But the corrupt officer found only silence, his growing fear visible in the security footage. The surveillance room settled into a focused quiet as the team prepared for the next day's revelation. 3 years of work, thousands of hours of surveillance, countless undercover operations, all leading to this moment. They had recordings of every meeting, copies of every document, proof of every transaction. In his command center, the lead agent reviewed the operation one final time. Everything was in place. The corrupt officers had no idea that their attempt to frame an innocent man had given federal authorities exactly what they needed: irrefutable proof of their crimes, captured from every possible angle. As night fell over the city, different teams maintained their positions. Surveillance continued, evidence was prepared, and final preparations were made for the coming day. In a few hours, a courtroom would become center stage for a revelation that would shake the entire police department to its core. The trap was set, the players were in position, and justice was about to be served in a way no one in that courthouse would ever forget. The courthouse buzzed with unusual energy that morning. Regular courthouse staff noticed small changes: new maintenance workers in the halls, unfamiliar security guards at the checkpoints, suited individuals speaking quietly into their earpieces. Inside the courtroom, Attorney R arranged her files with steady hands, though her heart raced with anticipation. The prosecution team looked confident, even smug. Officer P and his partner stepped behind their lawyer, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The news spread through the city like wildfire. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts. Cell phones buzzed with notifications. Social media exploded with video clips from the courthouse steps. Inside the federal building downtown, interrogation rooms were filled with arrested officers. Some broke down immediately, offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Others maintained their innocence, even as evidence of their crimes played on screens before them. Officer P sat alone in an interview room, staring at his reflection in the one-way glass. His perfectly pressed uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a costume. On the table before him lay photos, transcripts, and bank statements, 3 years of crimes documented in painful detail. "I want to make a deal," he finally said to the federal agents. His voice cracked as he began detailing operations that went far beyond what investigators had uncovered. Names were named, dates were given, locations were revealed. Each confession opened new avenues of investigation. Meanwhile, at the police station, internal affairs officers and federal agents worked side by side, seizing computers and files. Officers who weren't involved in the corruption watched in stunned silence as their colleagues' desks were searched. The thin blue line had been breached, and no one knew who to trust anymore. The police chief called an emergency press conference. Standing before a forest of microphones, his face grave, he addressed the public. "Today marks a dark chapter in our department's history, but also the beginning of essential change. We will cooperate fully with federal authorities to root out corruption at every level." Behind the scenes, Agent T worked with the federal task force, helping connect dots that only an inside observer could see. His detailed notes, recorded mentally during 3 years of undercover work, proved invaluable. Each piece of information he provided led to more arrests, more revelations, more evidence of how deep the corruption ran. In the following days, the investigation expanded beyond the police department. City officials were questioned. Business leaders were subpoenaed. The drug cartel's network of influence had reached into every corner of local government. The public defender's office was flooded with requests to review old cases. Every arrest made by the corrupt officers was now suspect. Attorney R found herself at the center of a legal storm, working long hours to help overturn wrongful convictions. "We need to review every case these officers touched," she insisted during a meeting with Justice Department officials. "How many innocent people are sitting in jail because of their lies?" The question hung heavy in the air, leading to the formation of a special task force dedicated to examining past convictions. Community meetings were held in churches, schools, and community centers. People shared stories of harassment, of evidence appearing mysteriously during traffic stops, of pressure to plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit. Each story added to the growing picture of systemic abuse. Local news stations ran special reports featuring interviews with former suspects who'd been framed. One elderly woman described losing her home after being forced to pay legal fees to fight false charges. A young father talked about missing his child's birth because he was in jail for a crime he didn't commit. The city council held emergency sessions to discuss police reform. Body camera requirements were strengthened, oversight committees were formed, training programs were overhauled, but the damage to public trust couldn't be repaired overnight. In the federal building, Agent T prepared his final report. His desk was covered with photos of the corrupt officers, their crimes now exposed to daylight. He thought about the small moments that had led to this point, the careful gathering of evidence, the patient building of relationships, the calculated risks taken at just the right times. The drug cartel's response was swift and desperate. Their protection network had been shattered, their distribution routes exposed. Intercepted communications revealed panic among their leadership. Without corrupt officers providing cover, their operation in the city was falling apart. Federal agents moved quickly to take advantage of the chaos, launching coordinated raids on drug warehouses and safe houses. Each location had been carefully noted during Agent T's undercover work, and now that intelligence proved invaluable. In the weeks that followed, more officers came forward voluntarily, offering information in exchange for consideration during sentencing. The blue wall of silence crumbled as former friends turned on each other, each revelation leading to more arrests. The local newspaper ran a powerful series of articles documenting the investigation from beginning to end. Reporters pieced together how a few corrupt officers had gradually built a network of protection that allowed drug traffickers to operate with impunity. The story's impact reached far beyond city limits. Police departments across the country began reviewing their own procedures. Politicians called for nationwide reforms. Civil rights organizations used the case as evidence in their ongoing fight for accountability in law enforcement. As the dust began to settle, Agent T prepared to move on to his next assignment. His work had exposed not just criminal corruption, but the systemic failures that allowed it to flourish. The changes sparked by this case would ripple outward for years to come, affecting police departments and communities across the nation. 1 year after the courthouse revelation, the city had transformed. The police department operated under new leadership, with transparency and accountability at its core. The new chief, a respected veteran from another state, had been carefully chosen for their track record of reform and community engagement. Inside the renovated police headquarters, changes were evident everywhere. Body cameras were now mandatory and couldn't be turned off during any interaction with the public. A civilian oversight committee had officers right in the building, their presence a constant reminder of the department's commitment to change. "Show me your community engagement numbers," the new chief asked during a morning briefing. Officers now spent mandatory hours each week meeting with residents, attending community events, and building relationships in the neighborhoods they served. Trust had to be rebuilt one conversation at a time. The Internal Affairs Division had been completely restructured, with new investigators brought in from outside the department. They maintained an anonymous tip line that actually worked, and every complaint was thoroughly investigated. Officers learned that covering for colleagues' misconduct wasn't loyalty, it was a fast track to ending their careers. In the courthouse, things had changed too. The judge who had presided over Agent T's revelation now led a special committee on judicial reform. They reviewed evidence handling procedures, scrutinized warrant applications more carefully, and required body camera footage for all arrest-related hearings. The Public Defender's Office had received additional funding and resources. Attorney R now headed a special unit dedicated to reviewing convictions from the corrupt era. Her team had already overturned dozens of wrongful convictions, reuniting families torn apart by false arrests. "Another one cleared today," she announced to her staff one morning, holding up approval papers for a case they'd fought to overturn. The young man in question had spent 2 years in prison on planted evidence. Now he was free, with a formal apology from the city and compensation for his lost time. The former drug houses had been transformed. Community organizations bought the properties at auction, turning them into youth centers, job training facilities, and affordable housing. Where crime once flourished, children now played in newly built parks. Local businesses noticed the change too. Without corrupt officers demanding protection money, small business owners could invest more in their shops. New businesses opened in previously troubled areas, bringing jobs and economic growth to neighborhoods that needed it most. The city's success became a model for police reform nationwide. Law enforcement officials from other cities visited regularly, studying the new procedures and systems put in place. The new chief frequently spoke at conferences, sharing their experiences and lessons learned. At the federal level, lawmakers used the case to push for national police reform legislation. The bill, named after the city, mandated higher training standards, created new oversight mechanisms, and provided funding for community policing programs. The drug cartel that had once operated with impunity found no foothold in the reformed city. Their attempts to corrupt new officers were quickly exposed and shut down. Without police protection, their operation withered and moved elsewhere, only to face increased scrutiny from law enforcement agencies now alert to their tactics. Former Officer P testified at multiple trials from his prison cell, helping prosecutors dismantle what remained of the criminal network. His cooperation didn't earn him leniency. He still received a lengthy sentence, but his testimony helped bring closure to many victims of the corruption. In police academies across the country, the case became required study material. Cadets learned about the warning signs of corruption, the importance of reporting misconduct, and the devastating impact of betraying the public trust. The story served as both a cautionary tale and a roadmap for reform. Agent T occasionally returned to the city, though few recognized him. He would sit in local diners, listening to residents talk about how things had changed. Sometimes he drove past his old house, now occupied by a young family, and smiled at the children playing safely in the front yard. The city's transformation wasn't just about policy changes, it was about a fundamental shift in how police and community related to each other. Regular town halls allowed residents to voice concerns directly to police leadership. Officers attended neighborhood cookouts and local sports events. The us versus them mentality had been replaced by a genuine partnership. Statistical reports showed the impact. Complaint numbers dropped, solve rates for serious crimes improved, and community satisfaction surveys showed growing trust in law enforcement. Most importantly, both officers and residents reported feeling safer and more connected to their community. The story's real ending wasn't about criminals being caught or systems being changed. It was about a city learning to heal and grow stronger. The scars of corruption would always be there, but they had become a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the power of positive change. As the sun set over the city's skyline, a new shift of officers headed out on patrol. Their badges, once tarnished by their predecessors' crimes, now shone with renewed purpose. They carried with them not just the weight of their responsibility, but the hope of a community that had learned the hard way that justice, though sometimes delayed, would eventually prevail.